Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Hello from Vermont, where it is both sunny and snowing outside right now. I'm Jenny Rushlow. I'm the Associate Dean for Environmental Programs at Vermont Law School, and we'd like to welcome you to the 16th Annual Norman Williams Distinguished Lecture in Land Use Planning and the Law, hosted by Vermont Law School's Environmental Law Center. The history of this lecture is that Norman Williams came to Vermont Law School in 1975 after a long and distinguished career in public service and in teaching, and particularly in the area of land use planning. And he played a key role in founding Vermont Law School's Environmental Law Center. So the Norman Williams Distinguished Lecture in Land Use Planning and the Law series is a gift of Frances Yates, a trustee of Vermont Law School, in memory of both Norman and Anya and Charles Yates, who were also alums of the school. Today, for our 16th Williams Lecture, we are very pleased to welcome Justice Anita Earls. Justice Earls is an Associate Justice of the North Carolina Supreme Court. Before she took office on January 1st, 2019, she was a civil rights attorney litigating voting rights and other civil rights cases for 30 years. She was also the founder and executive director of an organization called the Southern Coalition for Social Justice, which is a nonprofit legal advocacy organization based in Durham, North Carolina. During the Clinton administration, Justice Earls served as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the U.S. Department of Justice, the Civil Rights Division. And she is Board of Elections in the North Carolina Equal Access to Justice Commission. Furthermore, she has experience teaching. She's taught as an adjunct professor at the University of North Carolina and the University of Maryland Law Schools, as well as in the African and African American Studies Department at Duke University. She's a graduate of Yale Law School and Williams College, and she lives in Durham, North Carolina. For our presentation today, we will be accepting audience questions using the question chat function on your screen. And we welcome you to type in questions at any time during the presentation. And after Justice Earls gives her talk, we will have a Q&A where I will read out questions from the screen and Justice Earls will answer them. Her talk today is titled Implications of Implicit Racial Bias for Environmental Justice. Please join me in welcoming Justice Anita Earls.
Well, thank you so much. I am really thrilled to have this opportunity. Thank you for that amazing introduction. I have to confess that I was so excited about the chance to come to Vermont. So I'm sorry that I missed that. But I was also, while I was campaigning for this office, in North Carolina, we elect our judges. So for 1 year as a full-time candidate, environmental law was actually an important element of what I wanted the people of North Carolina to know my record on. And I on occasion cited a Vermont Law School article which calls North Carolina's Supreme Court the sinkhole of environmental law. So that's a reputation I hope we will change, and there's some good cause for that observation. But all of that is maybe our way of just saying how much respect I have for the work that I know you're doing, and how deeply honored I am to have the chance to interact with all of you, and I am definitely looking forward to your questions. So my plan under the circumstances is to talk a little bit about big picture, what I see the enterprise of environmental justice work is, and what implications I think the concept of implicit bias has for that work. I'm going to share with you a tool, which I'm sure you're probably already aware of, but just give you some examples of a tool that I think, given our understanding of implicit bias, becomes really important for us as lawyers and advocates to be able to use, to talk about sort of a case study of a case I was involved in, and then hopefully during the question and answer, to be able to hear from you about what your experiences have been, and to have some kind of exchange. So that's my plan, and I'll start then with the slides. And I apologize for whatever technical issues are. So this image, which is a big ball of twine, apparently there's a huge competition between some states over who has the biggest ball of twine. But as I've been thinking more recently from the perspective of being on the court, as well as the perspective of 30 years of being a civil rights advocate, this image, this notion that injustice in the world is like this big ball of twine. And as in this picture, we can't always see the top. We don't know the full extent. We see the part of it that is facing us. But what I firmly believe is that if we keep pulling on these strings, that when we do social justice work, whether it is environmental justice work or school desegregation or housing discrimination or advocating on behalf of immigrants or poor people, whatever part of it that we are trying to unravel, that we are really making a difference, and that we will one day make real progress, and that this big ball of social justice is not as big as it used to be. And so we are following in the footsteps of those brave souls ahead of us who were willing to try to pull on these strings and unravel injustice. So that is big picture worldview, what we're doing. The next slide is an attempt to address the current relevance of what I'm going to talk about with what we're all facing right now. And so we know, and this data is incomplete because not all states keep racial data, but it's certainly been in the news, and we know that that the impact of deaths from the coronavirus there's been a racially disparate impact. This was the most recent data I could find, and it's only 12 states, so it's not the full universe of the thousands of people who have died, but you can see that African Americans are 32% of all the deaths reported when they're reported by race. And the next slide will give you a little more context, because this, again, as I said, is only 12 states. And so the figures are that while African Americans are 13% of those living in these 12 states that have data by race, they suffered 32% of the deaths in those places. And I think we've seen play out in the media the kind of, I think it's an interesting point for litigators. Questions about, well, like we've had to be reassured that no, the virus doesn't discriminate. It's not the virus that's searching out African Americans to make them ill and kill them. It's obviously the underlying health conditions that African Americans in this country experience, and that of course is somewhat tied to the environmental disparities that we know they experience. But think about, from a legal perspective, if we were trying to hold someone responsible for this, would we say that we're looking for intentional racial discrimination? No, obviously we're not trying to make a virus intentionally racially discriminatory, although there may be some illnesses that are tied to race in some way. We know this virus isn't. And I think in my mind, it's a metaphor for how the search, often as we are trying to address issues of racial discrimination, the search for an evil intent, the search for a bad actor who is intending to discriminate, is totally beside the point and is not where we need to focus our efforts. The next slide talks about, ripped from the headlines today, the New York Times reporting that the Trump administration is going to weaken regulations on the release of mercury and other toxic metals. And who is that going to impact? I just really quickly, if you go to the next slide, I looked for what data do we know about where these plants are located, so who will be impacted by these increases in levels of mercury. And a 2017 report tells us that the racial minority share of the population is higher than the national average by 12 percentage points. And similarly, the percentage of population below the poverty line is also higher. So not surprising, at least initial, again, quick, not a environmental scientist, but my quick look shows us that that decision today is going to more heavily impact, not exclusively impact by any means, but will more heavily impact people of color and poor people. I think in the next slide, I did a quick look at what the study was showing about impacts on the minority population generally, and they were identifying EJ. So the interesting thing about this study from 2017 is that they had an entire section on environmental justice and the impacts on minority communities. So they conclude that some environmental justice populations would be more highly exposed to mercury, and that that related both to mercury that gets into the air as well as mercury that gets into the water, that it impacts particularly populations that eat more fish, which turns out to be minority populations. And of course, the impacts of having too much mercury in your system include impacting your brain functions and IQ and all sorts of other really negative things. So this is just a quick review to say that what we're dealing with now in talking about environmental justice really is timely. It really matters to people's lives and to what's happening right now. So I think the next slide is probably just a quick transition to what are the topics we're talking about. So what's implicit bias? There are a number of different folks doing a lot of research on the concept and a number of different definitions. I just looked at the current institute's definition, and I think it is useful to think about it, because when you hear the words, most people think, well, I know what implicit means and I know what bias means, and I think the concept is a little deeper than that. And so it does refer to the attitudes and stereotypes that we have that impact us in an unconscious manner. Important to note, they can be positive as well as negative biases. They can be neutral. Maybe key is the fact that we are not consciously aware of them operating, but they can impact decisions that are made, our perceptions, and our behaviors. And so we can conclude that they impact, they create barriers to equality and opportunity. So on the next slide, I just go a little bit further into implicit bias. So these concepts were developed through research at Harvard. The implicit association test may be something you're all very familiar with, but the idea is that your response, so the way that they, since these biases are unconscious and we're not aware of them operating, how do we know they exist? How do we know they are operating? How do we know about them? So I think the implicit association test is an effort at demonstrating that our brains are processing information faster than we can be aware of it. And so what the test shows is that your response is easier when two things that are being related to each other in your mind share the same, in your mind they're related, whereas if in your mind they're not related, it takes you longer to respond. So this is just a little graphic of someone supposedly taking the IIT test, and there's IIT tests for all sorts of factors, right? So not only race, but gender and disability and age and national origin, and like I don't know the full number, but I would guess it's in the hundreds of different implicit association tests that you can take. And certainly there's been in the research some criticism of both, does the test really test what it purports to, and does, even if it does, there's no sort of, the critique is that there's no real connection, no demonstration of a connection between the implicit associations that we have that are operating outside of our conscious mind and decisions that we make in the real world about what to do. So I acknowledge that there are, you know, there's a lot you could, when you start delving into the science, certainly there's critiques that are worthy of review. But I do think that it's a really powerful way of understanding how discriminatory outcomes result from decision-making processes where you can't identify the bad actor. And so then I'm just going to stay for 1 minute on the IAT test and give you a little example. So the next slide should have some words, and I challenge you, if you feel up to it, to out loud right now to yourselves, I assume no one else is listening, just say the color of the letters in each of these words, right? Just say them to yourself, run up and down the screen as fast as you can. Okay, you're probably done. Didn't take long. I want you to do the same thing on the next screen. Say the colors of the letters, not the word that it spells. So if I can get the next slide. Did that one take you a little bit longer? It must have. It takes everyone longer to say the color of the letters when what the letters are spelling out is not that color. And so it's just an example of how our brains work faster when we've already sort of like unconsciously made the connection. So on the next screen, this is the results of a different type of study that I think helps convince us that something's going on in our brains that's below our conscious level. So this researcher sent a legal memo to 60 different law firm partners, exact same memo. They had it written in such a way that there were some errors in it, some typos, there were some factual errors, there was, you know, it wasn't written with errors, but it also wasn't perfect. And then they asked the different partners to rate it. And they sent half of the partners a memo in which the individual, same name, Thomas Meyer, was identified as African American. The other half of the law firm partners, Mr. Meyer was identified as white. And when they got the ratings back, what they found was that the exact same memo got a 3.2 rating when the partners thought that Thomas Meyer was African American, and a 4.1 rating when they thought that he was white. And beyond that, the qualitative comments on the memos consistently were found to be different. So the next slide gives you a sample of some of those qualitative comments by the law firm partners. So looking at the same memo with the same mistakes in it, when they thought Thomas Meyer was white, they said he has potential, good analytical skills, you know, maybe needs to work on some stuff. Whereas when they thought he was black, it needed a lot of work. They can't believe he went to the law school they hypothetically said he went to, and he was just average at best. And this kind of difference in outcomes, when there is subjectivity of any nature in a decision-making process, I think we see across the board throughout all sorts of, throughout society, throughout all sorts of professions. Just as a quick aside, it was really fascinating campaigning across North Carolina because when I went to Charlotte, at every judicial forum I went to, people wanted to know about what do you think about the role of implicit bias in the courtroom and in our court system? Whereas in the rest of the state, there are plenty of counties that nobody else asked about it directly. You know, I'm not sure what's going on with Durham County, but no one else asked about it directly, and most of the counties didn't know what it was. So why in Mecklenburg? Because for the past 5 years, there's been an effort there spearheaded by a district court judge, then district court judge, who realized that in juvenile court, in one particular case, he had 2 juveniles come before him with all the exact, they had committed the exact same offense, They both had their family members come to the courtroom. They both had their pastor come to the courtroom. They both were urging the court not to recommend a custodial sentence. And yet, when the judge looked at the recommendation from the court personnel, for one young person, the recommendation was custodial sentence. For the other, it was to release him back to his family. And I don't need to tell you, right, that the custodial sentence was recommended for the African-American juvenile, and going back to his family was recommended for the white juvenile. And when the judge recognized this and said, I know that the court personnel that I work with, I've never heard them, do any of the things that we typically, stereotypically associate with racism, like they didn't use the N-word, they don't talk derogatory things about people of color. So he felt like he personally knew these folks, they weren't discriminatory, and yet these discriminatory outcomes were being recommended. So he started researching implicit bias, started a project to end the racial disparities in the juvenile justice system in the courts of Charlotte, North Carolina. And I think that that has really broadened to, within the legal community in that part of our state, a real recognition of the importance of addressing implicit bias. So let me, I think the next slide talks, switching gears, what do I mean by environmental justice? Well, you all are probably well aware of the EPA definition, fair treatment, and meaningful involvement in the development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws. The next slide goes a little bit further with the EPA because they've also come up with their vision. I can get the next slide. Their vision of, so we've defined what it is. How do we know when we've got it? Well, it's achieved when everyone has the same degree of protection, which these days I feel like is a low bar. like I want to say it's achieved when everyone enjoys, an optimal degree of protection. But at any rate, that's the EPA's vision. On the next slide, I've given you the definition that Federal Highways Administration uses, which is a little bit different because they're looking at making sure that highways, which builds roads across the country or widens them, that they are identifying adverse effects of the agency's programs, policies, and activities, and to have an equitable distribution of benefits and burdens, which is, in my mind, quite a different take on what environmental justice means. On the next slide, I have one of the recognized founders of the environmental justice movement. This is a comment he made, I think, in an interview, but breaking it down a little more simply as the principle that all people are entitled to equal environmental protection, the right, and I'm glad he adds this next sentence, the right to live and work and play in a clean environment. But maybe the easiest definition is the next one, which is on the next slide. This is what we know is not justice, when the rich get richer and the poor get their byproducts. So I wanted to, the next slide is just a nod to the fact that North Carolina is one of the early birthplaces of the environmental justice movement, although I know there's been work around these issues before 1982 and with grassroots groups around the country for many years. But I think in some ways it came together when these brave folks sat in the road to stop PCB waste in Warren County from being brought into their poor majority Black county. So then on the, I think on the next slide, this is like the heart. It comes in the middle of my presentation. It's the heart of what I want to say, and that is that when you merge these two concepts, when you think about what implicit bias is and how it operates, and what environmental justice needs, I think all too often when people talk about implicit bias, they do talk about individual decision making without kind of bringing that up to a systems level. And so I think it's not enough to talk about how we as individuals can counteract our own implicit biases. I think we have to ask, what does our legal system need to do to counteract the inevitable role of implicit bias in decision making, including all the different actors who make decisions that impact our environmental quality, and that it seems enormously obvious to me at that point that the only way that we can address and get to a point of environmental justice is if our test for what is discriminatory is a disparate impact test. And clearly, I think that means that it cannot be left to the Title VI enforcement agencies, that there absolutely has to be a private right of action to bring a discrimination claim on a disparate impact theory, that statistics alone should be enough. And I would even make the case that that's the standard that the rest of the world uses to measure discrimination, and that we really need to beat the drum about the importance legally, that as lawyers and legal professionals, our little piece of that twine that we're pulling out is to say, here's what needs to be in our legal doctrines to protect people, and it needs to be a disparate impact test for proof of discrimination. So I put that in red. If you forget everything else, remember that. That is, in my mind, what the impact of implicit bias is for understanding what we need to do in our environmental justice work. So then, going back to the notion that these biases are implicit, how do we then, in the environmental justice context, address and prove the discrimination that's going on? Well, one huge excellent tool at our disposal is mapping. So I've got a couple of mapping examples just to kind of feed your imagination about how do we use maps to show discrimination. So this is, and I apologize that these are somewhat old examples, but I think you'll be able to bring the concepts to whatever you're working on. So in December of 2008, a legal aid program started hearing from some of their clients that the Sacramento Natural Gas Storage Company was going to give those in the African American community $500 cash and a $200 gasoline credit card to get to purchase the mineral rights underneath their home. And you know, I think the question became, well, what's going on here? How do we evaluate this? So what they did was they mapped it. So the next slide shows you the map they drew. And on this map, the little circles tell you the income of the residents in the census tract. The outline in I can't use the pointer, but the little circle outline there is the area that underneath which they wanted to buy the mineral rights. And then the shading shows you the percentage African American, percentage people of color in the census blocks that were going to be impacted by this field that they're trying to purchase the mineral rights to. And so what this shows you, without a chart and a lot of numbers, is that they would this was going to predominantly impact low-income people and people of color. The next slide is a slightly different way of depicting disparate impact by race. This is Toledo, Ohio, and each dot is where there was a public health-led investigation, and then the shading shows the percentage non-white by census tract. So again, it's clear that the risk of exposure to lead is concentrated in the parts of Toledo that are predominantly African American. Just a couple more of these. The next slide is air pollution in Connecticut. This is a little old, but the dots are the plants that are emitting air pollutants. They're a source of pollutants, and then again the shading shows the percentage minority in the census tract. And so the darkest blue census tracts are also where the most polluting plants are. Back in I'm not exactly sure the date of this data, but in the 2000s in Connecticut. The final map, I think, is I had to have a North Carolina map. This is Southern Moore County, where and here it's an interesting issue, not necessarily pollution, but who has access to the public benefit of having a sewer system, which, when you are on well water, can have, if that well water gets contaminated, there are health effects. But the black lines, so this is Southern Moore County, the town of Pinehurst. If you're a golfer, the US Open is often there. It's a resort town. Pinehurst is, but the area is this interlocking kind of jigsaw puzzle of 3 different municipalities. So the blue on this map are the town boundaries of the town of Aberdeen. Yellow on the map are the town boundaries of Southern Pines, and then the green is Pinehurst. Taylortown, which is labeled up there, is a separately incorporated town that is almost all black. Many of the white areas, though, are predominantly African-American areas that have never been incorporated. So Jackson Hamlet is like 90% African-American, and there's the white area that's surrounded by Aberdeen is called Midway. So these areas that aren't incorporated, as you can see, don't get sewer. The black lines on the map are the sewer lines. But then you might ask me, well, what about way up on the left-hand side of this map, sort of the northwest corner? There's a whole big sewer system right out there in a bunch of area that's not color-coded, so it's not incorporated. What's going on there? Well, that is actually a wealthy, big subdivision of high-income homes, predominantly white. And so this map does take a little explanation, but basically what developed in this region of North Carolina was a system where the black neighborhoods don't get public services and the white neighborhoods do. So that, I hope, and I think the next screen just then moves us on to a case study, but I hope that those maps gave you a sense of how powerful it can be to use mapping to illustrate disparate impact, basically is what we're doing, using it to illustrate disparate impact, but to help people see the inequality without having to identify a single decision maker who said, I'm going to make sure that all these lead exposures in the black community, or I'm going to make sure that we target African Americans in some way, when that isn't entirely, at least that kind of conscious decision making isn't always entirely what's going on. So the case study I want to talk about is an effort that a community in Gates County. Thank you. Yeah. So this slide. So Gates County is in northeastern North Carolina. It's a very small county that I think the population is under 10,000. It's I do know that they have one stoplight in the entire county. This map is one that the clients drew. The blue through there is the Shawan River, and the Navy was experiencing this started back in 2007. The Navy was experiencing lawsuits, like several lawsuits and liability for the Super Hornet jets that were practicing. So the Super Hornet jets land and take off of aircraft carriers, which is a risky thing to do out in the middle of the ocean. So they need somewhere to practice. And so they build what they call outlying landing fields. And they were practicing at the Naval Air Station, Oceana Naval Air Station, but there were affluent Virginians living on the all around this air station, and they were suing over the noise pollution and the really disruptive impact of having these Super Hornet jets land and take off in their backyards. So the Navy first decided to put it in Washington County, North Carolina. Those residents filed a lawsuit and stopped the Navy. So the Navy said, okay, we'll go to Gates County, because Gates County is even smaller and even poorer. I mean, that's not what they said because of, but at any rate, they were going to Gates County. So on this map, the red square is the actual footprint of the outlying landing field, and the shaded in oval is the buffer zone area, and the government would basically condemn everything within the oval would be taken for governmental use, and the landing field would be there. And so I think I might have said Gates County is about 40% African American, and the community there faced a real challenge of how to address this, how to stop this from happening in their backyards. And so they used a wide range of tools. So the next slide shows the mapping that they did to demonstrate, and a large part of what we were trying to illustrate here was really the overlap between the impact on the environment and the impact on the human communities. And for me, it was a very interesting experience going around. So we tried really hard to get a lot of traditional environmental groups to support us in this effort. And then, I don't know if now they would have the same reaction, but then their reaction was, well, you have to find some plant or some bird or something in the environment that's impacted, and then we can help you. So we did that. We, the Southern Coalition, partnered with the Environmental Law Clinic at Duke. So what those quick maps, we can go back to them. Duke's Environmental Law Clinic, so these are folks doing environmental law. They quickly put together some maps that overlay the outlying landing field and the buffer zone with some of the natural environment factors. So I think we went past, if you go back one more.
We're having some technical difficulties on the slides, unfortunately. Just slow down for the moment.
Okay. It was useful to have them doing the mapping, and to have, they obviously had expertise and the ability to merge data about protected species. So one of the maps I had there showed 3 different protected species that were inside this zone. And then the other part, and maybe the more interesting part of the effort, was we had to start out with the community helping people understand that at least under Title VI, as a legal matter, we would have to show a disparate racial impact, because in the community, folks were saying, this is not racially motivated. It's going to impact white farmers as much as black farmers, and it was in some ways a very, and I think this is often true of environmental justice matters. You're working in communities that maybe have not partnered together. So in Gates County, up until that point, when we first started with this effort, there was a Gates County NAACP, the Black communities organized, but they had never been able to elect a candidate choice of the county commission, which made them not happy. In other words, they knew that whites in Gates County wouldn't vote for a Black candidate. They felt like their issues as African Americans were not being taken seriously by and considered by the white population in the county. And we had to consciously, from the beginning, take the time to lay the groundwork for the effective community organizing that could occur across racial lines. So what did that look like? That meant sometimes having the community meeting for the opposition. So this was, and understand, this was a long-range effort. The plans for the outlying landing field were announced in 2007. Community started getting organized 2007, 2008. It wasn't until 2013 that they actually achieved their goal. The Navy finally said, okay, we're not going to build the landing field. But as we were getting this effort off the ground, it was really important to have these communities come together and see their shared interest. And some trade-offs happened. So I started to say sometimes the community meeting happened in the Black church, sometimes it happened in the white church. They formed a organization that consciously had African American leaders and white leaders on the board, and they really worked together to listen to each other about what their concerns were. And so then the white residents opposed to the outlying landing field organized in support of a Black candidate for the county commission, and they elected an African American to the Gates County Commission. I think in 2008, it might have been 2010, but for the first time in anyone's memory. So they understood that their enterprise was a political one, in the sense of it wasn't just going to be a lawsuit that potentially could stop this, that they wanted to influence the Navy's decision making at the very beginning, and they understood that they needed to work together and organize together as a community. So some of the other slides that I was going to show you were advocacy materials that community folks put together, because the other thing that they I think understood and almost viscerally was that they needed to tell the stories of the people in the community and how they would be impacted. So they put together essentially a social history of their community, and they were able to make use of so they pulled together experts. They had experts who did a shadow environmental impact statement and found a mussel that was going to be injured if this outlying landing field was built. But they also had a woman who did oral history interviews with a lot of community residents, and from that developed photographs and a kind of a booklet that described family histories of people living in the community. They learned that they had Native Americans living in this area that would be covered, that had previously been relocated by the government from another area where they owned land, and many of the people living in this part of the state have histories that go back over 100 years. So there's something in the state called the Century Farm, where if you have a farm that's been operating for over 100 years, you get a special designation. Well, there were century farms that would have been taken through this process. So they told the stories in a really effective way that was respectful of and knowledgeable about the cultural history of the different racial groups that were going to be impacted. And I think I can wrap up Gates County with a slide. If you can go forward. I know that this one seemed to be problematic, but if you can go forward a few more, because I've told you all about the maps. They wanted to show some of the areas. You know, imagine a Super Hornet jet flying over what you're looking at right now. That's what they were trying to say would be impacted. The next slide, and I think the next few are, yes. So they had in the small rural county, 800 people come to the first public hearing, and it's a pretty racially diverse crowd. The Community United opposing this. The next slide shows you some of the homes. So this couple, Mr. Beard was actually building this house himself. That's all his own labor going into building a house, and it was within the area that would have been, you know, the government would have taken the house and knocked it down. The next slide is, I think the next two you can just skip through pretty quick. The Millers are a family that had been farming for over 100 years on their land. Next slide tells the story of, or maybe I left out some of it, but anyway, this is my lessons learned slide. So we were interdisciplinary in the sense of not only involving scientists who could talk about the environmental impact, but also sociologists who with expertise about telling people's personal histories and that kind of background as well. Clearly, we needed to be a multiracial effort in a deep way. Needed to be committed for the long term. And they told their story. I didn't get to give you the full picture because they actually did a video with music scenes from their life in the county and how that would be disrupted. And it was absolutely pivotal that this be locally led. And so let me say just a word about, so how does implicit racial bias impact all this? In many ways, I think we had a lost opportunity because what the people in the community struggled with was, well, we're not saying the Navy's, we don't want this to be a environmental justice issue. We don't want it to be about race. We're not saying the Navy's racist, because a lot of people in Gates County are either current active members of one branch of the service or another, or they're retired. And so they didn't want to be anti-government, all of which made total sense. And yet, how could part of the explanation of both how they might win legally, but even more fundamentally, why Gates County was chosen over other counties, I think did have to do with the implicit bias of decision makers who have certain stereotypes about poor Black communities. I mean, Gates County is like one county over from Warren County, right? The same place where folks were having to sit down on the ground to stop the PCBs from being trucked through their county. They had to acknowledge that history. And at the time we were doing this advocacy effort, we didn't have the implicit bias frame to help them navigate what they were saying about why this was happening to their community. But I also think in another way, we didn't have the ability to file a disparate impact lawsuit as we could file a Title VI complaint with some agency or another, probably 2 or 3 that we could pick from, but it wasn't. So the fact that the law has not caught up with the science of how discrimination happens has impacted our ability. So you can go to the next slide. I wanted to, as I was emphasizing local led, I wanted to leave you with the words of environmental justice activists about what they want to see, how they want to see this work go forward. And these are quotes from a woman who was being interviewed about funders, but I think the funder language, it applies to all of us. That is to say, her hope is that the work of frontline advocates not be a footnote in the work, and that all of us understand and resource the role that the community groups play by supporting them with adequate resources. The next slide gives you, identifies the woman making these statements and the rest of her greatest hope, that all stakeholders work together, and that the supporting groups understand that they have as much to gain or lose. So that was a quote from an interview on, I think, NPR from Sharon Lewis. I do have a couple more things to share with you. So the next slide, we can get the next slide. This is just to make the point that there are groups around the country, grassroots groups, wanting to protect their environment, wanting to highlight the ways in which their environment is unsafe. And if we have, I want to make sure I save time for Q&A, so I'm not going to tell the story of Newtown Florist Club, but if you don't know about this group of remarkable women in Gainesville, Georgia, I had the honor, true honor of representing them in a voting rights case. That's how I know about them, but they are true environmental justice pioneers and community activists in the greatest sense of the word. And they exemplify what all these other groups show, which is that when communities come together at the grassroots level, they will address the issue that's most immediately impacting them. But then if they realize the power that they have to make a difference, they start addressing the other issues that they also care about. So that big ball of twine, like those groups on the ground in their communities recognize that they're all interrelated. So Newtown Florist Club is filing a voting rights lawsuit in the 1990s to try, even though one of their key efforts was environmental justice and continues to be environmental justice for the residents of Gainesville. So if you Google them, you can learn a lot more about their history. I have a couple more things to share with you. If we go to the next slide, this is transition. So if you want to learn more about what legal advocates are doing to achieve what I'm saying needs to happen, and that is that we follow a disparate impact method of proving racial discrimination. There's a lot of groups engaged in it. I just highlight one, the Equal Justice Society in California. This has certainly been a mission of theirs, and they have some resources. They do a lot of implicit bias training. They have some resources on cases that have been brought that raise implicit bias explicitly in one way or another as it impacts the case. So I urge you to check out their website. They do also do environmental justice work. And then I felt like I could not talk about this topic without mentioning, I think it's the book on the next slide, Implicit Racial Bias Across the Law. It's a little bit dated, it's from 2012, but Rachel Godsil has a chapter in this book about environmental law. But what the book does more broadly is, I think, identify what our task is as lawyers, and that is, it talks about all sorts of areas of the law, like how implicit racial bias has impacted our tax law, and our corporate law, and our property law, and so that is my hope, that we can look at our legal doctrine, and while there's plenty of examples of explicit racial bias in the history of our legal doctrines, I think it's also important to identify how implicit bias has shaped the law, and how that continues to perpetuate systems of discrimination that then play themselves out in disparate outcomes for people of color. I think that's my last slide, and I think we're also right at 5 o'clock. So hopefully that means we can now go to questions and answers.
That's right. Thank you so much for that. That was fascinating. We have about 15 minutes for questions, and we've gotten quite a few of them, many of them complex. I don't envy you in having a succinct answer to them, so we'll get to them as many of them as we can. This first one is from one of the students in our environmental justice clinic here at Vermont Law School. The question is, the Trump administration is proposing changes called the secret science rule that will weaken the scientific underpinnings of policymaking. Along with the gutting of the mercury and air toxic standards, these two drastic potential changes will undoubtedly have a disparate impact on communities of color and low-income communities. How do we continue to inform the most affected communities and populations of these dangers during a time when the country's focus is on COVID-19?
Well, I think that people are struggling for answers as to, why is it so people get it that these are different, that the reason African Americans are more often getting ill and dying is because of social factors, and certainly the medical field has extensive research in the social determinants of health, like they get it. So I think that that exactly what you're pointing to is exactly what people are struggling and want to know. It's like, how did we get to a situation where some people are clearly so much more at risk than others? And part of the answer is because this is what the government has been done and then is stopping doing. So I think a huge part of it is breaking it down. And sometimes it's hard, like it feels like it's a lot in the weeds about policy and regulations and what they might mean. But I think whether it's by mapping who's impacted or some other visual way, I think that people will listen because it's what they want to know.
Thank you. So the next question is, with COVID, we're seeing particularly devastating impacts on people with pre-existing health conditions and people who are institutionalized, detained, or in other kinds of congregate settings, with significant disparate impacts on people with disabilities. So the question is whether you've given thought to the inclusion of people with disabilities in the concept of environmental justice.
Absolutely. So I think the inclusion of people with disabilities comes in a number of ways, right? So, you know, and a lot of this is stuff that I feel like as a lawyer I can't, or lawyers we can't do, and that's where we have to be interdisciplinary. But to what extent are disabilities either caused by the environmental contaminants or environmental conditions, or maybe it's a matter of simply the environmental conditions are hindering what otherwise might be a way to mitigate the impact of a disability. So it's both how there might be a causation factor, but then also how it how does that limit their ability to be resilient in the face of the environmental factors that are happening? So whether that's a virus that's being spread, or climate change and the impacts of climate change, or you know, other ways that the environment and environmental conditions are things that people need to respond to and try to address. I think we definitely need to be looking at what supports, and in some ways, like what legal theories, like are there legal theories we can develop to advocate on behalf of people with disabilities that you know, take into account the environmental factors that they're facing.
On the flip side of that, there's a question related to NIMBYism and how it is that we can achieve policies to promote environmental justice without them unintentionally then being used by the wealthy to fight against projects in their backyards, fight undesirable projects in their view. And so the question was whether there are ways to ensure that these policies are, that we prevent those policies from being abused in those ways.
Well, that's a really good question. And I think I feel like in every environmental justice case I've dealt with that was about a negative land use, because they haven't all been like that, but everyone that is, it inevitably comes up, you know, that we need to build a solid waste plant somewhere, or, you know, we need, and I think there's a couple, so I just, and this is very much sort of from a practitioner, this is not so much a conceptual answer, but very much a practical on the ground answer. And so part of my answer is that what my clients inevitably do is question, why should anyone, right? So if they don't want that solid waste dump in their backyard, what can they be doing to alleviate and ameliorate the need for it at all? With the outlying landing field, the clients were questioning, does the Navy, can we examine the Navy's ultimate decision that they needed one to begin with? And rather than say, okay, our campaign is to keep it from our county, but put it over here in this other county, their campaign was to say, no, actually, we don't need it. And so one place that you can sometimes go, and it seems to me it doesn't always work, but is to really focus the effort and the energy on eliminating the need to denigrate the environment at all, right? And then it seems to me the second answer I would have is that this is where you need to just have some clarity about that what you're, why disparities are unfair, and that and this is where I think some of those definitions of environmental justice can be somewhat helpful, because what you're saying is you don't want anyone to be privileged, and so I think when that's the criteria, then it becomes harder for folks who already are privileged to somehow use it to amass even more privilege, if that makes sense.
This next question makes me think of some of the lessons we've learned and applied in the externalization of environmental harms through the use of carbon taxes and methods like that. This person is asking, is there a mechanism that would allow the market to account for disparate impacts? Or does the disparate impact test help alleviate environmental injustices when the decision maker is not a person or group of people, but rather the market? Is the disparate impact test inherently biased by the market, or can it be?
I'm struggling a little because I think that might be the answer to that question might be context dependent, but it seems to me that the market is, well, you know, the market is people making decisions, and at the end of the day, the bottom line is a disparate impact standard says you shouldn't have a system that permits people to be uniformly disadvantaged as compared to other people, basically. And in my mind, it's like this, you know, fundamentally humanistic, we are all equal concept. And so I don't see that I think that concept should be applied to market decisions as well as any other decisions. It might mean you have to do different things in different contexts to eliminate the disparate impact, but I feel like it doesn't matter how you got there. If one group is being disadvantaged, then that needs to be corrected. Our systems need to correct that.
Taking it back to the more concrete, particularly for some of our students, would like to know, do you think there are adequate legal tools to positively remedy environmental racism? And if not, then what should lawyers focus on to be most impactful?
Yes, so again, a great question about, and I sort of hear that kind of as a, do we use the courts, or, you know, is there any kind of legal advocacy that helps, or do we just, or should there just be organizing? And again, to my ball string analogy, I think like we need to pull this apart at every possible place. But I recognize that there are real trade-offs, and we don't live in a completely limitless world. So people have to make choices about how they spend their time. So I get that. So yes, you need to be strategic. And there are places where you may not have a state or federal court. You may not have an administrative agency. You may not have a state agency. There may be no sort of governmental body that's going to address the environmental justice issue that you are facing. I do think that even though, so are our legal tools sufficient? Absolutely not. But I do want to lift up state constitutions, and to think that there can be short-term and long-term strategies, right? So I know that, you know, we want to go to federal court because then we'll set a precedent that applies across the country. If federal courts just aren't favorable right now, state courts are an interim, short-term strategy I would submit, and again, depends on your state. But there are, I think, ways to use state constitutions. I would just love to see a lot more advocacy around the rights that are in state constitutions. There have been some groundbreaking decisions saying that state constitutions provide much greater protection, either under equal protection clauses or other specific non-discrimination clauses that may be in state constitutions. So don't underestimate the legal tools, although yes, they are inadequate. I feel like being in a state court now, being on the other side, being a judge, I really see the impact of when people's cases and causes and claims are not brought to the court system. So yes, courts are only one avenue. Maybe it's the legislature, maybe it's an administrative body that can do what you need. But when we abandon the courts, it really shapes the law to the disadvantage, I would submit, of future generations, and that the courts are a place where we go for redress of grievances. So And this is where the locally driven issue comes in, that it's really not only a lawyer choice. There's an interactive process, I would argue, between clients, community, and lawyers as to what the strategy should be. The final thing I'll say really quickly is the process, the legal process of marshaling facts and presenting them in a persuasive way before, in theory, a neutral decision maker can have enormous benefit, even irregardless of the ultimate outcome. And so I would also say not to underestimate that.
Okay, well, there are a number of other questions that I would love to ask you, and I'm really sorry to the people whose questions we didn't get to, but we are out of time. So I'd like to thank Justice Earls for those really important thoughts, and thank you for touching on, the crisis that we're facing right now and making that real for us, and how this all, the work that we've been doing every day and the work we've been doing for years factors into what we're facing right now. So thank you, Justice Earls.
So can I just offer, I don't know if you have emails, but I would be happy to, I do feel badly that I'm much too long-winded, and I would be happy to try to answer any questions by email. So if anyone wants to just email me to follow up, I don't want to overpromise, but I don't think so I'm happy to give out my email. It's just my name, Anita Earls @gmail.com, very easy. If you'd like to interact and ask your question that way, I'll respond.
That's so nice of you. Well, with that, I want to thank you again, and also want to thank all of you for joining us today. I hope this gave you something else to think about for a few minutes, and I just want to wish you all health and safety and peace during these difficult times. And if you do want to return to this webinar, share it with others, it will be posted, the recording will be posted to the event website within the next week. Thank you very much.
All right.